webinars. This topic takes a deeper look at the practice of daily stand-up and daily scrums, and really helps think through some of the situations where it is the situation a little more complex, like distributed teams and so on, and then helps you think through some of the do's and don'ts. So there's a lot more to cover here, and I won't give everything away, but this is a good topic. We'll cover the topic today. By way of logistics, we'll have roughly 45 minutes or so, as usual, of the presentation material, and then we'll reserve some time at the end, which is 10 minutes or so, for questions and answers. So I'll keep track of the questions. You're welcome to post your questions as you see they come to your mind, as you see the content, and I'll be the referee to figure out which questions can be answered along the way because of the nature of the question itself, or which should wait till the end. And with that, let me introduce the speaker. I'm delighted to have Charles Bradley as a presenter. He's a professional Scrum trainer and an Agile coach. He's coached a number of teams on various Agile practices, including Scrum, XP, and various technical practices also in various technologies. And he actually comes from software development background, so he really knows what it takes to practice Agile. With that, let me turn over to Charles. Charles, take it away.
Okey-doke. Welcome to everybody around the world. Today we're going to talk about effective daily Scrum patterns. So Hemant already mentioned a little bit about me, so I'll just kind of touch on that. I'm a professional Scrum trainer through scrum.org, and I teach 3 classes: Professional Scrum Foundations, which is a two-day class; Professional Scrum Master, which is also a 2-day class. It's more of an intermediate to advanced class. And then coming soon, I'll be teaching the Professional Scrum Developer Java class, which is kind of a technical class that focuses on PDD and emergent architecture and lifecycle management for software projects. So I'm really excited to teach that new class. That little background on me: I started Scrum in 2008. I was a Scrum development team member doing Java development, and I was sort of voluntold to be the Scrum Master for my team because I was the only one on the team who had a Scrum Master certification at the time. And that eventually sort of propelled me later to become a Scrum coach. And now I've trained and coached numerous teams on Scrum. I do short-term and long-term engagements, and my background is, like I said, as a Java developer and a background in computer science. So a little overview of our talk today. First, I want to set the stage a little bit in terms of talking about the daily Scrum patterns. Then we'll go through each of the pattern categories kind of one by one. We'll do the talk order patterns. Then we'll take some Q&A. We'll do some obstacle resolution patterns, some facilitation patterns, a little more Q&A, and then we'll talk about who participates and who attends the Daily Scrum. And then we'll talk about working with the Scrum Backlog at the Daily Scrum. So, and then some Q&A at the end. We're going to be going pretty fast today, and so I wanted to leave some Q&A points in between the slides for me to take a deep breath and accept a question, and Hemant is going to handle that for us. So again, given the time that we have, I'll be going pretty quickly through these. So the first question I'm sure you're probably asking is, why should I care about daily Scrum patterns? I think there's sort of 2 levels of answer there. The first level is a lot of people don't really understand some of the things about the daily Scrum and how it's specific to Scrum. And Hemant kind of touched on this earlier when he mentioned the daily stand-up or the daily Scrum. And we're going to talk about that here in a little bit, about how the daily stand-up and the daily Scrum are actually subtly different, and they're kind of different practices. So on the one level, I want people to kind of become comfortable with what the Scrum Guide talks about in terms of what the daily Scrum really is. And then the second level is, I want you to potentially have some ideas looking at these patterns for your team, and look at the context for each of the patterns and determine, is this a potentially good pattern for us to try? And remember, just because you try it once doesn't mean you have to convert over to using that pattern forever. And there are sort of advantages and disadvantages to each pattern, and we'll talk about those. So this is a simple framework around Scrum patterns that I've devised, and we're not going to talk about it a lot, but I just kind of want to briefly introduce you to it. Essentially, at the top we have Scrum patterns, and all Scrum patterns respect the Scrum principles. And then there's sort of 3 subcategories under that. The Scrum technique pattern, which is something that directly supports the practice in Scrum, where techniques can vary, and the Daily Scrum is a good example of that. It's a required practice in the Scrum, but the techniques for doing the Daily Scrum can vary differently. And then there's optional Scrum patterns, this one in the middle. This one is for practices that are complementary to Scrum, but they're not required or specified directly by Scrum. An example of that is release planning. So a lot of teams do release planning, but that's not actually required by Scrum. It's kind of an optional practice. And then the third category, which I'm still kind of playing around with and I'm not totally sold on yet, even though it was my own idea, is the idea of a Scrum mashup pattern. And this is where we can combine the Scrum technique patterns and the optional Scrum patterns, sort of create a set or a mashup of lots of different things. So today, when we talk about the Daily Scrum pattern, we're going to focus mostly on the Scrum technique patterns, and specifically, we're going to narrow it down to just the Daily Scrum. So before we go through these patterns, I want to give you a warning. You know, the best way to completely kill any kind of creativity and innovation is to blindly follow other people's patterns. These patterns are not a concrete methodology; they're just ideas. And so, I want everyone, you know, in this session today to remember that, you know, don't ever hesitate to use your own technique. It doesn't resemble one of these patterns. So mix and match, combine them, tweak them, create a new pattern. That's fine. These are just ideas to consider. They're not in any way an official part of Scrum or anything like that. So I say this because I don't want people to sort of blindly follow the patterns. I want them to kind of use some good judgment and some, you know, creative thinking in terms of applying the patterns. So talking about what the Scrum Guide actually requires of the Daily Scrum. So the purpose of the Daily Scrum is to inspect and forecast and adapt the plan for the next 24 hours. So it's an inspect and adapt meeting of sorts. The Scrum Guide rules are that it's a 15-minute time box. It needs to be at the same time and place each day to reduce complexity. Each team member explains what they did yesterday, what they're going to do today, and what obstacles are getting in their way. And only the development team members participate in the Daily Scrum. Now, remember that Scrum defines a developer or development team member as anyone who is responsible for turning requirements into a done product increment. So we're talking about programmers, testers, architects, business analysts, whoever is involved in that process on your team is part of the development team. So in the Daily Scrum, though, only the development team members participate, and the Scrum Master should be enforcing this rule. And again, this is coming straight out of the Scrum Guide. And the Scrum Guide also makes it clear that this is not a status meeting. And we'll talk a little more about that later. So there is no Scrum Guide guidance on who can attend and observe, you know, without participating. How you handle the obstacle resolution, whether inside the meeting or outside the meeting. And it actually doesn't have any guidance on whether you stand up or sit down. So this is where a Daily Scrum is kind of different from a Daily Stand-Up. A Daily Scrum doesn't actually require that you stand up during the meeting, whereas a Daily Stand-Up, but just by its very name, is sort of a generic agile pattern, sort of does require people to stand up. So it's important to kind of lay this foundation of what the Scrum Guide says in terms of the definition of the Daily Scrum before we move on. So we'll talk about several different pattern categories today. We'll go into 3 top order patterns, and then we'll talk about 5 different obstacle resolution patterns and 5 facilitation patterns. And then we'll talk about a couple of patterns related to who participates in the Daily Scrum. And then we'll talk about a few patterns related to who attends the Daily Scrum. And then we'll talk a couple of patterns about the sprint backlog and the Daily Scrum. Now, we'll also be covering some sort of anti-patterns and controversial patterns as we go along as well. So the first category we're going to talk about is top order patterns. This is the order in which people talk in the Daily Scrum. So the typical round robin pattern that most people are familiar with is one person starts, and then the top order proceeds in some spatial pattern, clockwise, counterclockwise, left to right, something like that. Teams will often stand in a circle or a semicircle. And this is a pretty proven and popular practice. It works well very broadly. It's possibly good for new Scrum teams. It's even good for experienced Scrum teams. It might be possibly bad for teams that are bored with their Daily Scrum format. So they may want to change it up. But remember, I encourage you to sort of experiment, not necessarily say, okay, we must change from one format to another format. Just say, hey, let's try out this new format a couple of times and see what we think about it. So one of the other formats for the talk order in the Daily Scrum is what's called the talking stick pattern. In this pattern, the person that's speaking in the Daily Scrum holds a talking stick or a token of some sort and sort of helps keep the team focused on the conversation and who's talking. And this can help keep interruptions and side conversations to a minimum. It also helps to understand, when one person is done talking, it's moved on to the next person. So some situations where the talking stick pattern is good are teams that are bored, just want to change it up and try something new. And I do this with my teams. After a couple of weeks of doing the round robin, I usually encourage them to try different patterns. Teams that have trouble focusing, if there's a lot of different people talking in the Daily Scrum at one time, by kind of having a token, it kind of focuses everybody on who's got the token, who should be speaking. And for distributed teams, I have a similar strategy called toss the microphone. And in this strategy, what happens is someone starts off the Daily Scrum, does their yesterday, today, and obstacles, and then they say, hey, Jim, it's time for you to go next. And then Jim does his status, and he says, hey, Sally, it's time for you to go next. And so they sort of toss the microphone metaphorically to each other, and this forces people to pay attention. And a lot of times when you have a distributed team, people are multitasking, a lot of video conferencing or audio conferencing. So this forces them to pay attention because they want to make sure they're not tossing the token to someone who's already spoken. And you can use a very similar strategy for co-located teams. In this one, you don't go round robin or left or right. You just go random order. So you have a token or a ball or something, that you toss around between team members, and the person who's talking holds that token and then throws it across the circle or across the semicircle to someone else, and that person catches it and starts talking. And again, this forces people to pay attention, and it changes up, just sort of the energy of your Daily Scrum. So it's a pretty good thing to experiment with. Now, this pattern might be bad for teams that are always doing the same patterns. You may want to change it up a little bit every now and then. And there may be some teams out there where they're kind of annoyed by the kitschiness of having the token, the weirdness of having the token and having to toss it around. But I find it works well. It kind of encourages self-organization.
Yeah, Charles, let's take one quick question. Can be confusing. So the question is, how can we relate a talking order to teams that are virtual?
Well, like I said, for distributed or virtual teams, the toss the microphone strategy works really well. So, basically, one person starts, and then they call out the name of the next person that's going to go, because usually you have some way of knowing who all is on the call. And even if that person's not on the call, it's okay. Okay, they can say, Amy's not here today, and say, okay, how about Bill? Why don't you go? And so that way, you're sort of passing the sort of metaphorical token from one person to the next person to the next person. And it also helps, especially with distributed teams, because now you know when that person's done talking. That's something I've experienced firsthand, even in a video conference. Somebody's doing their status, and you think they're done, so the next person, everybody's kind of waiting to see who should go next. And then they'll start, and then they'll realize this person wasn't actually done with their status. So by forcing that person to say, hey, Amy, why don't you go next? You're sort of allowing the team to self-organize, but also everybody knows who's going to talk next. So this is a really good strategy, I think, for the talking stick. For the round robin, obviously, you don't know who's next unless you have a list of attendees on a tool or something like that. That's why I kind of recommend this talking stick pattern for distributed teams. Okay. Yeah. All right, so here's kind of a controversial pattern for the Daily Scrum. In this pattern, rather than going sort of person by person for status, the meeting is, I should say, updates. The meeting is facilitated to go product backlog item by product backlog item. And so someone in the team indicates which product backlog item is being discussed, and then each person that worked on that backlog item yesterday or plans to work on it today talks about their sort of yesterday-today obstacles just for that particular product backlog item. And this one is possibly good for teams that have trouble getting closure on product backlog items, because it forces the team to realize a little more about how much work is being done on a particular one. It's also good for highly co-located and highly communicative teams where a lot of their tips and improvement info has already been shared because they're all in the same room talking. And so the Daily Scrum is more about just talking about individual product backlog items. But this can be bad for teams that normally share their improvement info at the Daily Scrum. Maybe they're not highly located. Maybe they're in different buildings or whatever. And so in addition to sharing yesterday, today, and obstacles, they also expect and adapt the plan by sharing info like, hey, does anybody know how to install the Eclipse plugin for Eclipse? Things like that. And when you focus the meeting just on the status of particular product backlog items, you can have a problem where this particular pattern or approach turns into a waterfall status meeting, which is an anti-pattern. And we'll talk about that here in a little bit. So also possibly bad for team members and teams who remember a little bit better chronologically yesterday, today, for their whole day, as opposed to having to say, well, this yesterday and today applies to product backlog item A, and this yesterday today applies to product backlog item B, C. You have to sort the information out. So it may find people to be a little bit confusing. So again, this one's kind of a controversial pattern. I wouldn't call it an anti-pattern, and I wouldn't call it a good pattern either necessarily. It's just kind of controversial. So now we'll come to obstacle resolution patterns and how we resolve obstacles either inside or outside the Daily Scrum. So the common approach that most teams take is to defer obstacle resolution until after the Daily Scrum. And that helps keep the Daily Scrum kind of short and sweet. One possible strategy for this is for somebody to use a hand sign or some other signal to indicate that someone would prefer that we defer that obstacles resolution until after the Daily Scrum. And this is good for most teams that have that prefer their short daily scrums, and of course any team that has trouble keeping the daily scrum time box, because one of the things that can really bust your time box is discussing these obstacles. It's possibly bad for teams that are smaller that can get everything discussed within 15 minutes. So this is a very common pattern that most teams use, but it's not the only one out there. So some teams actually allow obstacle resolution in their daily scrum. So this is kind of the opposite of the previous pattern. And this can include discussion or resolution, but you just got to be sure you stick to the 15-minute time box. So again, this is good for teams that are smaller or can live within their time box and also do their yesterday, today obstacles and discussions all within 15 minutes. And it's obviously a bad pattern to try to use for teams that are always busting their time box. And then some teams just prefer a short daily scrum. Once they get used to daily scrums, they like it to be short, and maybe 5 to 7 minutes is enough. And if you allow obstacle resolution, then it rarely goes 5 to 7 minutes. But this brings us to an anti-pattern. A lot of new teams, and this is not directly related to the previous pattern, but it's kind of indirectly related. A lot of new teams that are new to Scrum kind of have this view that all obstacles should be reported in the daily Scrum, and that's not necessarily true. Reporting obstacles is okay, but if you're saving them all up for the daily scrum, you end up with this big pile of rocks, this big pile of obstacles in your daily scrum, which can really impact your daily scrum or the discussion afterwards. So the other thing is it increases obstacle delays. So if you find out something 2 hours after today's daily scrum and you're going to wait 22 hours to the next daily scrum, you've now delayed the resolution of that obstacle by as much as 22 hours. So instead, what we want to do is report and resolve all our possible obstacles as soon as they're identified. So this is good for teams. This is only good for really situations where an obstacle appears shortly before the daily scrum, and it's easier to just discuss it at the daily scrum. For any other one, what I prefer to see teams do is report and resolve all those possible obstacles as soon as they're identified. And here's a new pattern, or another pattern that allows you to sort of handle some of this stuff that's not appropriate for the daily scrum or won't fit into the time box. And I like to call it the after party. Some people call it the after meeting. I like the after party because if you look at the picture here, I mean, who doesn't want to be at that after party? So that's kind of the joke I make, is that people like being invited to an after party. It's kind of a cool thing. In this pattern, the development team meets just after the daily scrum to handle anything that's appropriate. This might be a good time for non-development team members to attend and ask questions. It can also be a sit-down meeting. It's up to you. But again, let's not have a huge, long after-party because we've saved all our obstacles for the daily scrum. So one strategy for the after-party is to work your way on your topic list from the largest audience to the smallest audience. That way you don't have a lot of people standing around that don't need to be involved in the discussion. And another possible strategy is to vote with your feet. Allow development team members to, when they are not interested in a particular topic, they're allowed to leave the meeting, and there's no repercussions of that. So the after party is good for discussion.
Before you move off from this page, Charles,
Okay.
can you explain a little bit more the largest audience to smallest? What do you mean by the people are not clear who the audience is?
Okay, so like at the after party, you're discussing a particular topic. It may or may not be an obstacle. It could just be a topic that the team needs to discuss. And what you might do is, let's say you have 4 topics to talk about, and the first 2 topics require the whole team, and the second 2 topics only require like 2 or 3 people. What you would do is you would do the obstacles that require the whole team first. That way, as people finish a particular topic and they don't need to be present for the remaining topics, they can leave the meeting and their time is not wasted. So that's basically what that means. Okay. And which is also somewhat related to the vote with your feet policy, which I usually recommend. Okay. So the after party is good for discussions with people who are not in the development team, and it's good for obstacle resolution if you're deferring your obstacles. Or just where a discussion only needs a small subset, don't waste everybody's time. It's possibly bad for teams that might succumb to this anti-pattern we're about to talk about, where the after party completely defeats the daily scrum. So be careful. You want to have a nice fun party like this, but if you're not careful, it can turn into something like this with the police and trash and things like that. This picture down below is from a 16-year-old posted on Facebook that she was having her birthday party, and I think she was counting on like maybe 30 people, and about 4,000 showed up due to the power of Facebook. And riot police were called in, and there was a lot of violence and things like that. So when we have an after party where we're trying to inspect and adapt, we want to make sure that it goes well, it's enjoyable, and that we're getting things done. What we don't want to do is run into a situation where the party gets out of control and it's kind of a disaster. And I'll talk a little more about why that is here in this pattern. This is an anti-pattern where the after party defeats the daily scrum. So in this anti-pattern, 1 or more non-scrum team members just kind of takes over and bulldozes the after party, which harms the self-organization of the scrum team. It's almost like what just happened at the daily scrum is completely moot. And this sometimes happens when an authority figure kind of attends, and we'll talk about that anti-pattern later.
So one question, Charles, on this page is, how would the after party actually defeat the scrum?
Well, like for instance, if someone comes in and starts basically asking everybody's status, let's say they were or were not at the daily scrum and didn't hear it, they might come in and just start barking out orders for this person to do that, this person to do that, this person to do that, and all of a sudden the plan that the team made at the daily scrum is completely overridden by some authority figure or controlling person who comes in and starts ordering everybody around. So that would defeat what happened at the daily scrum and kind of harm self-organization, and frankly harms the scrum implementation too.
Okay, great, thanks.
So there's no known context where this pattern is a good one. If somebody knows of one, I'd love to hear about it. And later I'll put a link up where you can send me emails about things. And then it's pretty much bad for all teams, so it's an anti-pattern you want to avoid. And there are a lot of things to avoid in Scrum, a lot of anti-patterns, but I only mention, and when I work with others on these patterns, we only mention the ones that we kind of commonly see, not just one particular situation we saw. It's usually when we've seen it more than once. All right, so now we're going to move on to facilitation patterns, and then I think we'll take a few questions after that. I got to keep moving here quickly, though. Looks like I'm running a little short on time. So, stand-up meeting. Most people do their daily scrums as stand-up. It's a popular and proven practice, but as we talked about earlier, it's not required by the daily scrum. So this is good for pretty broadly for most teams, and they want to keep their time box. They want to have a good, quick daily scrum. It's possibly bad for distributed teams that attend a daily scrum via audio or video conferencing at their desks at home. It's a little awkward to stand up at home or reposition your video camera at home and that kind of thing. So I'm not saying it's bad for every team to do that. I'm just saying it's possibly bad for distributed teams who are doing the daily scrum from home. So the sit-down meeting is sort of the opposite of a stand-up meeting, where participants sit down for the meeting. And there's no Scrum Guide requirement. It has to be a stand-up, like we talked about. I would use this particular pattern with caution. On the left, you see there's a meeting with a bunch of people that looks like it could last a really long time. This guy's got a really big, thick binder of paper there. That could take a while. But then on the right-hand side, you see people sort of sitting at home. Looks like a couple of them are standing, sort of on Skype, having their sort of okay situation. So the sit-down pattern is sort of good for distributed teams that attend and they're at their desks at home. But it could be bad for teams that are time box busters because a stand-up meeting might help the daily scrum go quicker. And also it's possibly bad for just low energy situations. People seem to have a different energy when they're standing up doing a daily scrum than when they're sitting down. The close facilitator pattern is one where some facilitator, usually the scrum master, but not always, facilitates the meetings very closely. And they might give hints to the team member to mention something, or they might just ask insightful questions to help expose what's going on in the team and what's going on in the plan. And there's a still difference between a close facilitator and a controlling facilitator, which is an anti-pattern, and we'll talk about that one next. But in this pattern, essentially what happens is somebody's kind of closely facilitating the daily scrum. And this is good for new scrum teams who need a little bit of mentoring and teaching on how to hold an effective daily scrum. It's sometimes good for a distributed scrum team in order to keep it moving to know who needs to talk next. Sometimes the scrum master is the one that's keeping track of who hasn't talked yet and can kind of move the meeting along. I prefer the talking stick pattern that we talked about earlier, using the toss the microphone approach. But either way, it's kind of okay. And it's mostly bad for most scrum teams. You know, if they're already having good daily scrums and they don't really need the close facilitation of someone else, then we really don't need that kind of close facilitator. The development team should be self-organizing at that point and be able to have effective daily scrums. So an anti-pattern for daily scrum is having a controlling facilitator, and this is a much more sort of heavy-handed way of facilitating the daily scrum. And so someone, you know, controls it tightly, they might quiz the person on what's holding them up, things like that, and then controlling facilitator could be a scrum team member or a non-scrum team member, although having a non-scrum team member participate in the daily scrum is an anti-pattern, and we'll talk about that later. Consider maybe just insightful questions using the close facilitator pattern instead. And this kind of pattern also happens sometimes when an authority figure attends the daily scrum, and again, we'll talk about that as a later pattern. So this one's really not good for any teams that I'm aware of. This is sort of a command and control pattern, which is kind of antithetic to Scrum. And so some related patterns are when your daily Scrum turns into a waterfall status meeting, or when an authority figure attends. So waterfall status meeting and pattern is where your daily Scrum is supposed to be this inspect and adapt meeting that's self-organizing, but it turns into a status meeting. There's a lot of focus on the time that related to a particular task, product backlog. What percentage complete is this? How many actual hours have you worked on this? This is basically backsliding in the waterfall. Usually, and this can also happen when the product owner or some non-Scrum team member facilitates, which again is a little bit of an anti-pattern, or just when a command and control type facilitator is present, polling everybody, interrogating them, you know, that kind of thing. People usually dread going to these kind of meetings. Or sometimes people just appear to be reporting to a particular person that's at the daily scrum. That also is kind of a sign of a possible waterfall status meeting. And this often happens when an authority figure attends. So there's really no context where this is a good thing, and in fact the Scrum Guide specifically says this is not a status meeting. Of course you're going to share updates on what you're doing, but it's not the same as status, like I'm 46% complete, I think it can be done by Friday, and all that kind of stuff. There should be a lot more focus on what we have to do to get tasks and the product backlog items done, and a lot less focus on how we are deviating from our original plan. This is possibly bad, pretty much for any Scrum team. All right, so I'll stop here and take a little Q&A. Emmett, do you have anything for me?
No, I think I covered the questions along the way. So
in line. Okay, cool. I just wanted to put a stopping point for me to take a deep breath and maybe get a chance to get a word in edgewise. You're doing pretty good at that already, though.
Yeah,
so I appreciate that. So now we'll talk about who participates, and I want to make a quick point about the difference between attend and participate. Participate generally means you're doing the yesterday, today obstacles. Attend just means you're kind of an observer, and you probably don't talk at the meeting. Participate usually means you sort of talk at the meeting. Now, the Scrum Guide is very specific about this. It says that only the development team participates in the daily scrum. So this is kind of a controversial pattern where the product owner participates in the actual daily scrum. So the Scrum Guide, scrum.org, says only the development team participates, so the product owner doesn't participate, whereas the Agile Atlas from the Scrum Alliance says, well, maybe the product owner participates. They're not very clear about it. They kind of say they can certainly attend and might even talk, but they don't talk about whether they actually participate in the meeting or not. So this one's kind of a little bit of a controversial pattern. It's not terribly clear what the advice is. Having the product owner, though, out of my experience, can be good for teams that have a good working relationship with their product owner and will have fruitful questions and answer and have the ability to inspect and adapt. But it's definitely bad for teams where the product owner might exhibit an anti-pattern like a controlling facilitator or as an authority figure. And that's something you want to avoid in the Scrum team because, again, not only is the Scrum team self-organizing, but the development team is also self-organizing. So this one's a little bit controversial. It's one of those things where it might work well for your team, might not. And then here's an anti-pattern, and again, we've talked about this a little bit already. Somebody who's not on the Scrum team participates by speaking in the meeting or doing the yesterday's obstacles. And this is basically just a direct violation of the Scrum Guide, which says only the dev team participates. And you can see this guy's kind of breaking into the daily Scrum here. You know, obviously from time to time, people will talk productively who might not be on the Scrum team in the daily Scrum. And, you know, little comments here and there are something we probably don't want to worry about that much. But when someone is truly, you know, engaged in the daily Scrum and they're not on the Scrum team, that's really an anti-pattern to watch out for. So there's really no good context for this anti-pattern because it's, you know, harming the Scrum implementation. And it's pretty much bad for any Scrum team. If the outsiders need to participate, this is the after party is an excellent time to do that, and we talked about that pattern earlier. Have them talk with the team after the daily Scrum if they really need to have a deep discussion. So we talked about who can participate in the daily Scrum. Now we're going to talk about who might attend the daily Scrum. And really, there are no Scrum Guide rules or guidance on this, so really anyone can attend. So I want to talk about a few patterns and anti-patterns along these lines. So obviously, only the development team attends the daily Scrum. Now this one is a specific pattern that the dev team is the only people that are at the daily Scrum, so nobody else is there. And so the one thing you need to keep in mind when you're trying to do it this way is that the development team should make sure they're communicating with the wider organization well through any other mechanisms that your company already has. So this one's good for experienced Scrum teams because they don't really need other people to daily Scrum. But it could be bad for new Scrum teams or for teams that need the Scrum Master as shield, the development team, or even teams where the Scrum Master has been absent from the daily Scrum for a long time, and then the quality of the daily Scrum has gone down. So this is where this pattern might not work well. So that brings us to the Scrum Master attending the daily Scrum in this pattern. On the left here we have Mr. Miyagi's for teaching the sign here, and then on the right we have Mr. Miyagi protecting Daniel Sign, and these are two of the key duties of the Scrum Master, right? So having the Scrum Master attend is good for new Scrum teams, any team that needs a Scrum Master as a shield, or teams that just need a refresher on how to hold an effective daily Scrum. But it's possibly bad for any Scrum Master that exhibits an authority figure anti-pattern, and so hopefully we want to code the Scrum Master to not play their authority figure role in the daily Scrum. And it's also bad for teams that grow dependent on the Scrum Master for the daily Scrum. I mean, the development team is supposed to be self-organized. If you grow dependent on the Scrum Master to run your daily Scrum, then you're not really, achieving the full extent of self-organization.
Charles, let's take one question
Sure.
which is on this page. So do you consider Scrum Master as a part of a dev team as defined in the Scrum Guide? Or not, and if not, then I guess the question is, what exactly is the role of Scrum Master being besides a Scrum Facilitator?
Well, those are good questions. They're very interestingly worded. So I'll take the first question. No, the Scrum Master is definitely not on the development team. And I think that's consistent between Scrum.org and the Scrum Alliance. They are on the Scrum team. So the development team plus the Scrum Master plus the product owner equals the Scrum team. So, and that's why that language was actually changed a couple of years ago to be very specific. So in terms of, well, what is the Scrum Master for then? Well, the Scrum Master has a whole list of duties, and they're all listed out in the Scrum Guide. And certainly one of them is to help facilitate Scrum events when needed. And the Scrum Guide is very interestingly specific on this. It says as needed or as wanted. And so the key there is that if you always have your Scrum Master facilitating every Scrum event, then your development team's not really achieving the pinnacle of self-organization. Now, that's not to say that it's bad to have a Scrum Master facilitating a lot of these events. It's just that if your team really wants to get to be a high-performing Scrum team, it has to pick up itself and self-organize at some point. And that means they will need the Scrum Master less for facilitation. Now, the Scrum Master has lots of other duties, like coaching the team on other things about Scrum and ensuring that Scrum is followed, and coaching the organization on how to do Scrum, and helping the product owner, and all kinds of things. These are all listed in the Scrum Guide, which is the scrum.org website. So there's lots of other things the Scrum Master can focus on other than just being a team facilitator. Okay. So having the Scrum Master attend, though, is generally a good thing, but it can be bad if there are dysfunctions that grow out of either the Scrum Master's presence or the Scrum Master's absence. So the next pattern is whether the product owner attends the daily Scrum or not. And this is possibly good for teams who often need to speak to the product owner at the after party. And like I said, it's a little bit controversial about whether the product owner should speak at the daily Scrum, but they're certainly welcome to speak at the after party. It's also good for teams where the product owner is already kind of a team player and really works closely with the development team. It's possibly a bad pattern to have the product owner at the Scrum, the daily Scrum, because some teams, especially ones that are kind of new to Scrum, forget that the product owner should be available throughout the sprint. You know, the 15 minutes of the daily Scrum should be the only time you see the product owner every day. So again, this is sort of like saving all the obstacles for the daily Scrum. A lot of new Scrum teams just assume that, okay, I save all my obstacles for the daily Scrum, and that's the only time I'm going to see the product owner and all that kind of stuff. But that's not necessarily true. So this particular pattern, while it's generally a good thing, can be bad if the Scrum team gets it in their mind it's the only time they're going to see the product owner every day. And then it's obviously bad for any product owner who's exhibiting an anti-pattern like a controlling facilitator or an authority figure. Which brings us to the authority figure attending the daily Scrum and the anti-patterns associated with this. This one can be anybody that's of authority. It could be a team lead, a manager, an executive, some powerful stakeholder. It could even be kind of a powerful product owner. This can be an anti-pattern for teams. It's not always an anti-pattern, but it can be. So it's kind of okay to have that authority figure there for rare visits to learn about Scrum and to just kind of see what's going on. It's also, you can't really avoid this pattern if your team has an authority figure on it. Maybe that's a manager that's on the Scrum team because he's also a developer, or maybe that's some sort of QA manager, and she's on the Scrum team because she also does testing for the team. And so sometimes it's hard to avoid having an authority figure on the Scrum team itself. So it's not in and of itself an anti-pattern to have that person at the daily Scrum. But the Scrum Master should coach these people that have sort of high authority or that write people's reviews to not act as their authority role at Scrum. Instead, they should be wearing their Scrum role hat, if you will, instead, and try not to sort of bring that authority, because again, it harms self-organization. And this anti-pattern is pretty much bad for any situation that's not described under the possibly good for section above. It's also bad for authority figures who don't realize the effect they have on a team. I've seen this happen multiple times in companies where the authority figure thinks they don't have any effect on the team, but then the 1 day or 2 days they don't show up to the daily Scrum, the daily Scrum magically changes into a quite different meeting where people are more open, more honest, and focus more on inspecting and adapting rather than saying what makes the authority figure happy. So it's somewhat akin to the lab coat effect where people being observed in a study, if they know they're being observed by people wearing lab coats, if you will, they're going to act differently. And some authority figures don't realize that that actually happens because they're never there when they're never there, you know. So, all right. So now we'll move on to the sprint backlog at the daily Scrum. And there's just a couple of patterns here to talk about. Viewing the sprint backlog at the Daily Scrum is a very common and proven pattern. Somehow the sprint backlog, or what's often called the Scrum board, is displayed at the Daily Scrum. Sometimes that's a physical board. Sometimes it's a photograph of the physical board. Sometimes it's a webcam pointed at the physical Scrum board. And in some situations where you have distributed teams or virtual teams, oftentimes it might just be some sort of agile lifecycle management tool, some screen of that tool. Usually it's the sort of screen that represents the sprint backlog. And by agile lifecycle management tool, I just mean something like a version 1 or a green hopper, or one of those kind of tools that you use to manage your backlogs for your agile work implementation. So here you have a team that sort of, it's, having their daily scrum in front of their board, pointing at particular items. So this is when the sprint backlog is really useful in daily scrum, is being able to just point and say, I worked on this, or I'm having a problem with this, or something like that. So this is good for pretty much any Scrum team, so long as you're not exhibiting some other, anti-pattern, which could affect what is shown on the sprint backlog. And really, I'm not aware of any context under which this is bad. But again, if somebody thinks that looking at the sprint backlog or the Scrum board here, the Daily Scrum is a bad pattern, I'd be interested in knowing about that situation. And here's a controversial pattern that's somewhat related. This is where a team updates the sprint backlog during the Daily Scrum, or maybe they're updating the burn down or whatever means they use to track sprint progress. If you notice in this picture, people are standing around, looks like they're probably doing their Daily Scrum, and there's somebody up at the board who's sort of updating the board or messing with the board. And you notice everybody's attention is focused on the person who's doing the updating as well as the board itself. And that's not necessarily what we want teams to focus on in the Daily Scrum. We'd rather focus on respecting and adapting, helping each other out, things like that, sharing improvement information on how to improve what they're doing. And when you're spending all your time updating the board, it can take away focus from the actual purpose of the meeting. So updating this backlog is possibly good for advanced or experienced Scrum teams who won't let that updating get in the way of the purpose of the Daily Scrum. But there's a whole host of situations where this pattern is possibly bad. New Scrum teams who, again, might get the perception that the Daily Scrum is all about updating status, and we don't want that. It's a little bit about updating status, but it's mostly about inspecting and adapting. It could be bad for teams where the updating just distracts and takes time away from the Daily Scrum. Moving stickies back and forth or marking new estimates on stickies or something like that might distract, and again, it disrupts the flow of conversation between development team members. It's also possibly bad where you're updating the board or the sprint backlog and there's an authority figure present. So I've seen this with teams where people kind of tend to tell what sells instead of telling what's actually so. And so they end up updating the sprint backlog to make it look pretty, make the burn down pretty, because an authority figure is attending and they want that authority figure to think everything's going just fine. And so this again can harm self-organization and openness and focus. And then there's just plain old transparency. If you only update your sprint backlog at the Daily Scrum, your sprint backlog could be up to 24 hours out of date, and that can cause all kinds of delays and deficiencies. And so much like we talked about how it's important to report the impediments as soon as they occur and talk to your team about how to handle them, same thing is true with the sprint backlog. It's important to update those things as soon as they need updating. And then I don't want you to forget, we talked about this earlier in terms of you don't have to use a specific documented pattern. So maybe you want to create your own pattern. And you can describe your pattern with some description, and then you can talk about, okay, this pattern is possibly good for these situations and possibly bad for these situations. And the reason I use very loose terminology around possibly good and possibly bad is because, again, I don't want anybody to get the impression that these patterns always work in this situation and always don't work in this situation. It's just possibilities. It's just ideas, food for thought and creativity, which brings us back to that warning I gave at the beginning of the presentation. Don't ever hesitate to use a technique that's not a documented pattern. And I want to stress this over and over again when I talk about these patterns, because I don't want people to think that they're cornered in, that they must use these patterns. These patterns are simply ideas for how to help improve your Scrum implementation. And again, the surefire way to completely kill any good ideas coming out of the Scrum community is to say you must do it one particular way. So please don't take this information that way. They're just meant to be ideas to consider. Don't use them as a a battering ram with your teams or with your teammates. And in closing, keep in mind these are not an official part of Scrum. These are just techniques for how to implement Scrum. Pay attention to the context. When you're thinking about using a particular pattern, look at the context. What it's possibly good for, what it's possibly bad for. Then think about how does that apply to your team. If it applies well, you might want to follow the advice of the pattern, which is to either do it or not do it. Or you may want to experiment with it anyway. Because again, just because we say it's possibly good for or possibly bad for, doesn't mean that it's always bad for the situation. You can find a PDF file summarizing all these patterns and kind of a nice chart on my website. It's scrumcrazy.com/ds-patterns. And this will help summarize what we talked about today. There's also links to this presentation. And I encourage anyone who wants to contribute their own patterns to see the link there, and there's information on how to contact me. And it's really not just me. There's several of us in the community that are working on this, and we're working on a little bit bigger scale, but we're starting out with Daily Scrum Patterns as a way to sort of show what it is we're working towards, which is ideas for how to implement Scrum. I think at this point, Heman's going to chime in and talk a little bit about what Synerzip does. And if you have any remaining questions, I'll take those now, but I know you want to talk about what Synerzip has to do as well.
So there are certainly a few questions. So all of the audience, we already have some questions queued up right now, and if you have any other questions, please keep sending them on the Q&A panel, and I'll keep track and I'll take a few of them. But before I take the questions, I just want to take a couple minutes and introduce Synerzip for those of you who have not been exposed to Synerzip. So Charles, we can advance the page. Here's a quick kind of overview in a couple of pages on Synerzip. So Synerzip in a nutshell, we are a software product development partner for small to mid-sized software companies. Most of our clients tend to be typically later stage venture-backed companies, but in general, small to mid-sized software companies. And for each company, we put together a dedicated team of high-caliber software professionals, which serves as an extension of the in-house team. And we follow agile practices, and thereby reduce the risk that is always there in software development and delivery. And we are really good in agile practices. And as you know, agile is not a rigorous approach. Thou shalt follow certain practices. You use certain values, agile principles and values, and apply them appropriately in your situation. And we help do that for our clients, given where they are in their maturity as a company and product. And then we are also able to reduce cost of development for our clients because we have a dual shore software development team, both on the US side as well as India. And we are able to provide a 50% or so cost advantage to our clients. And then final point about Synerzip is our flexibility we offer to our clients. Many of our clients come to us because they want to set up a development center in India, but don't want to take the upfront cost and complexity that they need. So we will become the development partner for them. And then over time, as the team grows and the situation warrants, we can allow them to take the team over and convert it into a captive operation. So it gives them the upside in the short term and the flexibility in the long term also. So next page, just advanced, that just gives a glimpse of some of our clients. These are, as you will see on the page, there's a bunch of images of logos. So it takes a few seconds to refresh.
Yeah, I switched it a minute or so ago. It's taking a while to get to my screen, I think.
Yeah. So, but the point is that we have a bunch of small to mid-sized software companies. Hopefully, you recognize some of the names, a few large ones too. But that's our work. We do good software development work, and we'd love to work with any of you guys on the call today. With that, let's turn our attention back to the topic of effective Scrum patterns and take a few questions that are queued up right now. So if you're ready, Charles, let me go through that list.
Absolutely.
Okay, so the first one is about this pattern that I've seen it in my client, this person, the audience has asked, which is Do you have any experience or comments or success with teams that tend to what is otherwise supposed to be daily scrum? They feel they only need it twice per week. Let's say it's a 4-week or month-long sprint, so it's not a very tight sprint. But so, any comments on doing daily, quote unquote daily scrum, but doing it only 2 times a week or 3 times a week?
Yeah, I would recommend against that. I really honestly feel like if a development team is self-organizing and working well together, that they should be meeting every day. And part of the reason for that is that, you know, like I mentioned before in a couple of the anti-patterns, when you're saving up all your obstacles for the daily scrum, or if your sprint backlog is out of date, all those kinds of things. Same is true of inspecting and adapting. If you have an obstacle, sometimes it's not even an obstacle. Sometimes you think you're doing the right thing, and somebody in the daily scrum will kind of be like, "Wait, I thought I was doing that," or you know, or if you think you're going down the right path, and maybe you think you're just fine, but someone else raises the point of saying, "Well, what if we did it this way?" All of those things are optimizations. And the longer you delay those optimizations by having a daily scrum only twice a week, the more it costs the company that you're working for. So I think having a short daily scrum, most teams can get to where their daily scrum is, 7 or 8 minutes at the maximum. Even the large teams, I've seen that happen. Again, if they're deferring their obstacles to the after party, that kind of thing. So my personal opinion and my experience, I mean, honestly, I don't think I have a whole lot of experience with teams doing this because when I coach teams, I coach them to do it every day. And that is the Scrum Guide requirement as well. It has to be done every single day. But I just can tell you from looking at the improvements that are made on a daily basis on the teams that I've coached, that if they were to wait 2 or 3 days, they would have wasted possibly 2 days worth of work. And daily Scrum is supposed to be held every day.
So, take another related question on one then. Any advice on doing this daily scrum at the beginning of the day versus end of the day?
Really good question. It's kind of funny because we have a pattern category called the start time that I excluded from the presentation because I wasn't going to have enough time to get all patterns. That's kind of funny. Somebody's asking about it. Yeah, generally speaking, if you have a team that's on very similar time zones, it's better to have it earlier in the day. That way you're sort of talking about what you did yesterday, and you all come together with a plan for how you're going to attack the day. The ones that I've seen that are later in the day, people are just recalling what they did, and they might create a plan for the next day, but then they kind of forget it overnight. And really that adaptation is the most important part. And if we kind of forget how we're going to adapt overnight, then that can be difficult. Now, if you have a team that's distributed or virtual, there may not be a whole lot of choice on having it earlier or later in the day because you need to pick a time and the entire team can participate. I've even heard of some teams who work with a dual shore model where they have 2 daily scrums, where they do one kind of in the earlier morning and one in the later evening, and even though that requires one half of the team to dial in from home or something, they're very strict about keeping the daily scrum for a very short amount of time. And that way, dialing in from home for 7 or 8 minutes doesn't really inconvenience anyone. But it also allows people to hand off work at the end of the day. If you want to hand off from your American team to your Indian team, then that allows, or vice versa, obviously, that allows you to have those kind of discussions. But again, keeping it to 10 minutes or less doesn't really inconvenience anybody horribly, outside of business hours.
Makes sense. All right, let's take another question, which is, you made a point to anti-patterns was to not update, use a daily Scrum meeting to start updating the Scrum backlog, right? And so the question is, if not, then what's the right time? When should the team be updating the Scrum backlog?
Okay, so first of all, a clarification on my advice is that it's a controversial pattern, which means it might work just fine for some teams. I'm not advising, and neither is anybody else who's working in this effort, to never do that. What we're saying is these are the risks of possibly doing that. So, but to answer your question a little more directly, the other part about when should we do it, you should do it immediately. As soon as something changes status, walk up to the board and move the sticky, or get onto your tool and change the status. And some of the online tools, that will trigger notification emails and things like that, and or put it into someone else's queue who will know that they have possible work, specifically things that can be tested. It's good to test early in the sprint. So it's really good for a programmer who's finished with a task that can be tested to indicate that status immediately, so the tester could get started on it immediately. So my advice is do it instantly, as soon as it's done. Maybe say, within an hour of the task needing to be updated, go ahead and update it. Or if you're doing a particular, there's other pattern how you update things. Sometimes it's not just moving it. Sometimes you have to re-estimate it. If you're one of those teams that re-estimates tasks every day, which is neither good nor bad, it's just a paper technique. Maybe you make a rule that everybody gets those things updated at least 15 minutes before the daily scrum. That way the scrum board is completely up to date when you have your daily scrum. You don't have all that confusion of updating those things. It also allows the person on your team that's updating the burn down to update that before the daily scrum, because that's useful inspect and adapt information. Knowing where you are in terms of meeting your sprint forecast is very useful information for the daily scrum.
So if you're updating in real time the Scrum status or the backlog, who should be responsible for changing the status on the board? Is it the team lead or is it the individual team member?
Well, I don't think that there is actually specific guidance in the Scrum Guide on this, and for anybody out there who's not familiar with the Scrum Guide, it's a great 15-page PDF. It'll take you about 30 minutes to read it, but it's a great resource for understanding on what correct Scrum is. And the Scrum Guide, I think, is pretty specific on this. Responsibility for updating the sprint backlog is actually that of the development team. Now, having said that, I've seen a lot of new Scrum teams where the Scrum Master handles that as part of a way of moving obstacles to the development team's productivity. But I definitely encourage teams early on to take that on, because I want the development team to be self-organizing as soon as possible. And so instead, what I would rather do is have the Scrum Master focus on making sure that it's been updated, and has it been updated or it looks like it's out of date. Go talk to people, ask powerful questions like, hey, I noticed you're working on this, so I'm wondering if this other task that you were working on is already done. And oftentimes the person will say, oh yeah, I finished that, this morning earlier. And then the Scrum Master might say, well, would you mind, maybe updating that in the Scrum backlog? That'll help keep the backlog up to date, that kind of thing. So while it's the development team's responsibility to update the Scrum backlog, it's also the Scrum Master's responsibility to ensure that Scrum is being followed and that the team is efficient and productive. So primary responsibility, development team. Secondary responsibility, the Scrum Master. But again, I don't want to turn the Scrum Master into the team's secretary or project manager or administrator. I want the development team to self-organize. That's the whole point of Scrum, is having self-organizing development teams and Scrum teams.
Right. Let's come back to one of the earlier questions, amplification, a comment rather, which is if you have a large team. The question earlier was, is it a really bad thing to do Scrum only twice a week or thrice a week? So one comment one of the audience members have posted on this one, which is worthy of bringing it up here, Charles, is
sure.
They have a large team, 10 people or so, Scrum team, very sizable Scrum team, and what they're doing pair programming, in pairs. So those pairs are staying in sync daily, hourly basis.
Sure.
But larger team only comes together once or twice a week, or twice a week in their case. So any comments?
It's basically the same comment I made before, because if a pair starts going off in a direction that the rest of the team could potentially realize is a bad direction, then, or even a good direction for that matter, then you're going to have to wait several days to get that information. Maybe a pair has discovered some really great technique, and each person in the pair is keeping each other updated really well. That's fine, but what about the other 8 members of the team? I think people underestimate the number of optimizations that are made at the Daily Scrum, and it's not like you can sit there and count it like you can count beans. People underestimate the amount of process value that comes out of the Daily Scrum, and by only holding it 2 or 3 times a week, you're really minimizing the benefits you can get at the Daily Scrum. And let's face it, the Daily Scrum's only 10 minutes a day. It's not like it's a big inconvenience, or maybe it's 15, whatever it is. It's a short meeting, so it's not like you're completely inconveniencing people by having that meeting. It's just one little bit of improvement saves you a day or two worth of effort, and that happens every single day. That's 7 days worth of duration in terms of optimization. So I think people underestimate how productive Daily Scrum is. So I encourage them to have every day. This is what the Scrum Guide says, but I'll just tell you why I think it's a good thing.
Let's take there are a few more questions, but let's take one final one that is again on the same topic or related topic. Is instead of doing a verbal Scrum, meaning they're standing around for 10-15 minutes and going through the round robin, otherwise, if they do a written form because they're distributed teams and so it is somewhat asynchronous. Is that acceptable on the real pattern, which is on some sort of a chat session or even a Word document? Everybody writes up the day, just what they did yesterday, what they plan to do today, and what obstacles. So obviously there's no dialogue, but at least there's a communication. So sure. Is there any thoughts on how well or that pattern works? Or is that an anti-pattern?
It sort of depends on how you implement it. If you implement it in a chat session, I guess you could argue that you have everyone there and you are doing the daily scrum and you are sharing your stats. If you do it as a written document that's passed around on email, then I don't know how you could argue that that's a live daily scrum. So I would consider the non-live daily scrum to be an anti-pattern only, and not even an anti-pattern, it's just a violation of Scrum. And that's the other thing, is that you have to remember that the Scrum rules are in place for a reason.